I really believe Portlock is evil.
There's a lot of strange stuff happening down there.
Deep in Alaska's frozen wilderness, there's a ghost town where the forest holds its breath. Portlock, a place where shadows move when they shouldn't, where the fog swallows entire mountains and the wind doesn't sound like wind at all. For decades, something has stalked these woods. Not a bear, not a wolf, something else.
Stories of Nuntinuk or Bigfoot out here, and we're gonna really have to watch our back.
The people who lived here swore it hunted them. They heard it breathing outside their doors, saw its shape in the trees, taller than any man, eyes glowing in the dark, until one day they vanished, overnight, leaving behind empty homes, half-eaten meals, and a single warning carved into a cabin wall. It's still here. This is the story of Portlock and the predator that defies nature itself, the cursed land. Welcome back to the Cryptid Report. The story begins in the late 18th century when British Captain Nathaniel Portlock first set foot on this remote stretch of land. It was the year 1785, and Portlock was exploring the Alaskan coastline, searching for new opportunities. What he found, however, was anything but promising. As Portlock and his crew ventured inland, they discovered something unsettling: the remnants of an ancient native village. The land was rich with resources. Game roamed the forests, fish filled the rivers, and the soil was fertile. It was the kind of place where a community could thrive. Yet, the village was empty. The people who had once called this place home were gone, leaving behind only traces of their existence. Portlock's crew was baffled. Why would anyone abandon such a bountiful land? Despite the mystery, they decided to establish a settlement. But almost immediately, things began to go wrong. Members of the crew fell ill, not from any known disease, but from a creeping, inexplicable fear. It was as if the land itself was alive, watching them, waiting for them to make a mistake. The final straw came when the crew began hearing strange noises at night, low, guttural growls that seemed to come from the forest. The sounds were unlike anything they had ever heard, and they filled the men with a sense of dread that no amount of logic could dispel. Terrified, the crew begged Portlock to leave. Reluctantly, he agreed, and they abandoned the settlement, leaving behind a land that would forever bear his name. But Portlock and his men were not the first to flee. Just 6 years earlier, a group of Spanish explorers had attempted to settle in the same area. They too had been driven away by a strange sickness and an overwhelming sense of fear. The Spanish crew reported hearing eerie cries coming from the forest, sounds that grew louder and closer with each passing night. One by one, they succumbed to the terror and fled, leaving behind a land that seemed to defy human habitation. So, what was it about Portlock that inspired such fear? Was it a natural phenomenon, like the infrasound some believe can cause feelings of unease? Or was it something far more sinister, a creature that had claimed the land as its own? As the years passed, more settlers would come to Portlock, each hoping to conquer the land. But none would stay for long. For in the shadows of the forest, something was waiting, something that would turn their dreams of a new life into a nightmare. The cannibal giants.
But then people started to disappear.
Just gone.
For nearly a century after Portlock's abandonment, the land remained untouched. The dense forests and rocky shores were left to the wildlife, and the eerie silence that had driven away the settlers seemed to settle over the area like a shroud. But in the mid-19th century, a group of nomadic Sugpiaq people decided to take a chance on the cursed land. The Sugpiaq knew hardship very well. They had survived in the harsh Alaskan wilderness for generations, and the resources of Portlock, abundant fish, game, and fertile soil, were too tempting to ignore. They established a settlement, hopeful that they could thrive where others had failed. For a time, it seemed they might succeed. But then, the attacks began. The Sugpiaq had faced threats before: raids from rival tribes, harsh winters, and the occasional predator. But this was different. The attackers were not human, nor were they ordinary animals. They were something far more terrifying, towering, monstrous beings that the Sugpiaq called cannibal giants. These giants were unlike anything the Sugpiaq had ever encountered. They stood over 10 feet tall, with massive muscular frames covered in thick, matted hair. Their eyes glowed in the darkness, and their movements were unnervingly human-like. But what set them apart was their insatiable hunger, not for game or fish, but for human flesh. Night after night, the giants descended upon the village. They moved with terrifying speed and precision, tearing through homes and dragging people into the forest. The Sugpiaq fought back as best they could, but their weapons were no match for the giants' strength. The attacks were relentless, and the village was soon on the brink of collapse. Strangely, the giants seemed to disappear when the forests were full of game, but as soon as the animals grew scarce, they returned, more bloodthirsty than ever. The Sugpiaq began to suspect that the giants were not just predators. They were hunters, stalking the village and waiting for the perfect moment to strike. By the early 20th century, the Sugpiaq could take no more. They abandoned Portlock, leaving behind their homes and the land they had hoped to tame. But they did not leave empty-handed. They carried with them stories of the cannibal giants, stories that would echo through the generations and cast a long shadow over Portlock. The Sugpiaq were gone, but the giants remained. And as the years passed, the whispers of their presence grew louder, drawing new settlers to the cursed land, settlers who would soon learn that the stories were all too real. But then, something even worse came along. The rise of the Nantinak, a modern-day nightmare. In the early 20th century, Portlock saw its third wave of settlers. This time, it was a group of Russian Alutiiq people, drawn by the promise of a new beginning. They built a bustling cannery, a post office, and even a school, transforming the once desolate village into a thriving community. But they were not naive. They knew the stories of the cannibal giants, and they were determined not to make the same mistakes as those who had come before. To protect themselves, the Alutiiq enforced strict rules. A nightly curfew was put in place and armed guards patrolled the village. Most importantly, they avoided the dense forests and foggy areas where the giants, or Nantinak as they called them, were said to roam. For nearly a decade, these precautions seemed to work. Portlock prospered and the Nantinak remained a distant threat. But then, in the year 1931, everything changed. It started with a logger named Andrew Kamluck. One day, Kamluck ventured into the forest to cut wood, breaking the unspoken rule to stay near the village. When he didn't return, a search party was sent to find him. What they discovered was horrifying. Kamluck's body lay in a mangled heap, his skull crushed by his own sled, a sled so heavy that no human could have lifted it. His loyal dogs, which had been pulling the sled, were found torn to shreds nearby. The scene was one of unimaginable violence, and it sent shockwaves through the village. The Alutiiq were no strangers to danger, but this was different. The Nantinak had never attacked so brazenly before. It was as if Kamluck's death had awakened something primal in the creature, something vengeful. Soon after, more villagers began to disappear. Hunters vanished in the forests, fishermen never returned from the bay, and even children were not safe. The bodies that were found were often mutilated beyond recognition, with deep claw marks and bite wounds that defied explanation. The Alutiiq tried everything to defend themselves. They increased the number of guards, tightened the curfew, and even organized hunting parties to track down the Nantinak. But nothing worked. The creature was always one step ahead, striking when and where it was least expected. By the year 1950, the Alutiiq had reached their breaking point. In a desperate attempt to outwit the Nantinak, they abandoned Portlock almost overnight. The entire village was evacuated, leaving behind only a post office worker to close up shop. For years, Portlock remained empty, a ghost town haunted by the memories of those who had lived and died there. But the Nantinaq was not done. In the decades that followed, hunters, hikers, and even scientists would venture into the area, drawn by the legends, and many of them would never return. The Nantinaq had claimed Portlock as its territory, and it would defend it at all costs. But what was this creature? A relic of a bygone era, a myth brought to life, or something far more sinister? The answers, like the Nantinaq itself, remain shrouded in mystery. A village in fear. By the mid-20th century, Portlock had become a place of legend, a ghost town where the wind carried whispers of the Nantinaq, the monstrous creature that had driven away its inhabitants. But for those who dared to venture into the area, the legends were far more than just stories. They were warnings, and they were all too real. In the year 1951, the last of the Alutiiq people left Portlock, leaving behind a post office worker to close up shop. For weeks, this lone man stayed behind, barricaded inside the post office as he fulfilled his duties. But even he couldn't escape the terror. Night after night, he reported hearing heavy, two-legged footsteps echoing through the empty streets. The sound was unmistakable. Something large, something deliberate was prowling the village. The man tried to convince himself it was just his imagination, but the footsteps grew louder, closer, until he could no longer deny the truth. The Nantinaq was still there, and it was watching him. When the post office worker finally left, Portlock became a true ghost town. But the Nantinaq's reign of terror was far from over. In the decades that followed, hunters, hikers, and even scientists ventured into the area, drawn by the legends. Many of them would never return. One of the most chilling accounts comes from the year 1969. A hunter, tracking wild goats in the forest near Portlock, suddenly found himself being followed. At first, he heard only subtle sounds, rustling leaves, snapping twigs. But soon, the footsteps grew louder, faster. The hunter realized with a sinking feeling that he was being chased. He ran, never daring to look back, as a blood-curdling scream echoed through the trees. The creature pursued him to the edge of the forest, where he finally burst out into the open, his heart racing and his spirit shaken. He never returned to Portlock, but his story spread like wildfire, adding to the growing legend of the Nantinaq. 5 years later, in 1973, another group of hunters had their own encounter. Seeking shelter from a storm, they set up camp near the abandoned village. As night fell, they heard something circling their camp, growling, snarling, and emitting eerie, unintelligible sounds. The men huddled together, their weapons at the ready, but the creature never showed itself. What they did notice, however, was the way it moved. The footsteps were heavy and deliberate, unmistakably two-legged. The hunters would later swear that whatever was out there was not an animal, at least not any animal they had ever encountered. But perhaps the most compelling evidence of the Nantinaq's existence came in the form of footprints. In the late 1970s, a group of hunters tracking a moose stumbled upon a set of tracks that stopped them in their tracks. The footprints were over 18 inches long, with a distinctly human-like shape. But they were far too large to belong to any human. The hunters followed the tracks, their unease growing with each step. In a clearing, they found evidence of a struggle, flattened grass, broken branches, and the moose tracks abruptly ending. The massive footprints, however, continued up the mountainside, as if the creature had dragged its prey away. The hunters returned to town with their story, but few believed them. Skeptics argued that the tracks could have been made by a bear or some other large animal. But those who had seen the prints up close knew better. Whatever had made them was no ordinary predator. Fact, fiction, and the unexplained. By the late 20th century, Portlock had become more than just a ghost town. It was a symbol of the unknown, a place where reality and myth collided. But as more people ventured into Portlock, the line between fact and fiction began to blur. One of the most compelling accounts of the Nantianak comes from the year 1990. A paramedic from Anchorage was called to assist a 70-year-old Alutiiq elder who had suffered a heart attack in the Eagle River jail. As the paramedic worked to revive the man, he tried to make small talk, sharing stories of his own outdoor adventures. But the elder remained silent until the paramedic mentioned that he had once hunted near Portlock. At the mention of Portlock, the elder's eyes snapped open. He grabbed the paramedic's shirt, his voice trembling with fear. "Did you see it? Did it bother you?" he demanded over and over. The paramedic was stunned. He had never seen such raw terror in a person's eyes. Even as the guards restrained the elder, his voice echoed down the hall. "Did you see it? Did it bother you?" This encounter, more than any other, highlights the deep-seated fear that the Nantianak inspired in the Alutiiq people. To them, it was not just a creature. It was a force of nature, a reminder of the dangers that lurked in the wilderness. But for skeptics, the Nantianak was nothing more than a myth, a story born of fear and superstition. So, what is the truth? Is the Nantianak a real creature, or is it a product of human imagination? To answer that question, we must look at the evidence, both for and against its existence. Those who believe in the Nantianak point to several key pieces of evidence. First, there are the eyewitness accounts. Over the years, dozens of people have reported seeing a massive, hairy creature in the forest near Portlock. These sightings are remarkably consistent. The creature is described as standing between 7 and 10 feet tall, with broad shoulders, long arms, and glowing eyes. Witnesses often speak of an overwhelming sense of dread, as if the creature exudes an aura of fear. Then there are the footprints. In the late 1970s, a group of hunters discovered a set of tracks that measured over 18 inches long. The prints were human-like in shape, but far too large to belong to any known animal. Similar tracks have been found throughout Alaska, often in remote areas where bears and other large predators are rare. Some of these prints even show dermal ridges, tiny patterns on the skin that are eerily similar to human fingerprints. Could these be the marks of a real creature, or are they just the work of skilled hoaxers? On the other hand, skeptics argue that the Nantianak is nothing more than a myth. They point to the lack of physical evidence, no bones, no hair samples, no clear photographs or videos. Without concrete proof, they say, the Nantianak remains a legend, not a reality. They also argue that many of the sightings and encounters can be explained by more mundane causes. For example, bears are known to stand on their hind legs, and in certain lighting conditions, they can appear eerily human-like. Similarly, the strange noises reported by witnesses could be the calls of owls, coyotes, or even the wind. As for the mutilated bodies, skeptics suggest that they could be the result of natural decay or scavenger activity. In the harsh Alaskan wilderness, it's not uncommon for bodies to be disfigured by the elements or by animals. They also point to the story of Andrew Kamluck, the logger whose body was found crushed by his own sled in 1931. Skeptics argue that Kamluck's death could have been an accident. Perhaps he struck his head on a tree branch or suffered a seizure. But those who knew Kamluck insist that he was an experienced outdoorsman, unlikely to make such a fatal mistake. Despite the skepticism, there are some aspects of the Nantianak legend that defy easy explanation. Take, for example, the trees. Over the years, many visitors to Portlock have reported seeing trees that had been uprooted and driven back into the ground upside down. This bizarre phenomenon, known as tree throwing, has no clear explanation. Some believe it could be the work of the Nantianak, using its immense strength to mark its territory or intimidate intruders. Others suggest it could be the result of natural forces, such as strong winds or avalanches. But for those who have seen the trees up close, the idea that they were uprooted by anything other than a massive, intelligent creature seems far-fetched. Then there are the stories of the Nantiinak's intelligence. Many witnesses describe the creature as not just a mindless predator, but a cunning, almost human-like being. It's said to stalk its prey with patience and precision, often waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Some even claim that the Nantiinak can mimic human voices, luring its victims deeper into the forest with calls for help. So, what are we to make of the Nantiinak? Is it a real creature, a relic of a bygone era that has somehow survived in the remote wilderness of Alaska? Or is it a myth, a story born of fear and superstition, fueled by the isolation and harsh conditions of life in the far north? The truth, as always, lies somewhere in between. For the Alutiiq people, the Nantiinak is more than just a creature. It's a symbol of the unknown, a reminder of the dangers that lurk in the wilderness. For skeptics, it's a cautionary tale, a warning against letting fear and imagination cloud our judgment. But for those who have ventured into the forests of Portlock and felt the weight of its silence, the Nantiinak is very real. It's a presence, a feeling, a shadow that moves just beyond the edge of sight. And whether it's a creature of flesh and blood or something far more mysterious, one thing is certain: the legend of the Nantiinak will endure as long as there are forests to hide in and stories to tell. As the sun sets over the abandoned village of Portlock, the shadows grow longer and the whispers of the Nantiinak grow louder. What secrets lie hidden in the darkness, and who will be brave enough to uncover them? A legacy of fear and wonder. As the 21st century dawned, Portlock remained a place of mystery, its abandoned buildings slowly being reclaimed by nature. The cannery, the post office, and the school stood as silent witnesses to the village's turbulent past, their walls echoing with the whispers of those who had lived and died there. But while the village itself lay in ruins, the legend of the Nantiinak continued to grow, drawing adventurers, researchers, and thrill seekers to its haunted shores. For many, Portlock is more than just a ghost town. It's a living, breathing enigma. The stories of the Nantiinak, the cannibal giants, and the unexplained disappearances have become part of Alaska's folklore, passed down through generations like a campfire tale. But for those who have experienced the terror firsthand, the legend is all too real. One such person is a hunter who ventured into the forest near Portlock in the early 2000s. He had heard the stories, of course, but like many, he dismissed them as exaggerations. That changed one night when he set up camp near the edge of the forest. As the sun dipped below the horizon, he began to hear strange noises, low growls, rustling leaves, and the unmistakable sound of heavy footsteps. At first, he tried to convince himself it was just the wind or an animal, but then he saw it, a massive, shadowy figure moving between the trees. The hunter froze, his heart pounding in his chest. The creature stood at least 8 feet tall, its broad shoulders and long arms silhouetted against the moonlight. It didn't attack or even approach him. It just stood there, watching. For what felt like an eternity, the hunter and the creature stared at each other, locked in a silent standoff. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the creature turned and disappeared into the forest. The hunter packed up his camp and left that night, vowing never to return. But his story, like so many others, added to the growing legend of Portlock. It also raised an important question. If the Nantiinak is real, why has it never been captured or killed? Some believe the creature is simply too shifty, a master of stealth that knows how to avoid detection. Others suggest it's more than just an animal. It's a supernatural being, a guardian spirit of the land that cannot be killed or captured. And then there are those who think the Nantianak is a relic of a bygone era, a creature that has somehow survived in the remote wilderness of Alaska, far from the prying eyes of modern science. But perhaps the most interesting theory is that the Nantianak is not a single creature, but a species. Throughout history, there have been reports of similar beings in other parts of the world, from the Yeti of the Himalayas to the Yowie of Australia. Could the Nantianak be part of a larger, global phenomenon? And if so, what does that mean for our understanding of the natural world? For now, the answers remain as unknown as the creature itself. Portlock continues to draw the curious and the brave, each hoping to catch a glimpse of the creature. So, what do you think lurks in Portlock's shadows? Myth, monster, or something we can't yet explain? Drop a comment below, and let's keep the mystery alive. If you're hooked on unsolved enigmas, smash that like button, subscribe, and join our crew of curious explorers. Until next time, stay brave, stay curious, and never wander too far into the fog.